The series of articles which we are now studying relating to the divinization of the physical consciousness and life, being among the last few that Sri Aurobindo wrote, they carry two special characteristics. One, that they are prophetic. They look at the future ahead, the work ahead, and although Sri Aurobindo never speculates idly, he yet presents the variety of possibilities through which the further development of the evolution and particularly the physical transformation and transformation of life will and may have to pass through. The second characteristic is that they capture much in broad sweeps, because in a sense he has pretty much already said whatever he wanted to say about pretty much everything that there is to say. In these articles, he covers in broad strokes many things which have been elaborated elsewhere decades before, but are placed rapidly in context in a single sentence, in a single sweeping statement. And if we do not see that this is what they are meant to do, sometimes these statements may appear very simple because they cover so many things in a single sweep. They may even be read superficially without fully recognizing the depth that they carry. In the passage which we are now reading, Sri Aurobindo puts in context the priority of the community such as this in the ashram and subsequently in Auroville, where there is an attempt to divinize life itself, in contrast with other spiritual institutions which reject life and exclude life from their spiritual seeking. He says the moment you take up life and matter into the scope of the spiritual transformation, then automatically you are prevented from isolating yourself from the world. Because if it is life that you want to transform, you cannot say, I will keep away from life and yet transform my separate piece of life. One has to accept life as it is and take it up for transformation. And yet the effort to transform demands a concentration, demands a specialized effort, and even a degree of isolation for the purpose of that transformation. And it's as if you have to struggle between these two extremes. On the one hand, you cannot separate yourself. On the other hand, you cannot do anything meaningful without some kind of separation. So he discusses the difficulty of keeping this balance in one of the later chapters in the Life Divine, where he covers the issues facing a Gnostic society. There he discusses how, at first, any attempt to transform life would be faced with ridicule. Subsequently, as the attempt progresses and some possibility of real change is seen, then that ridicule turns into criticism and even opposition, to try to subvert and destroy by opposing. If somehow one manages to get over that opposition and moves further still, then there is a third phase which takes place, which he says is the most dangerous and the most difficult, when the very forces which oppose now turn around and say, yes, we accept this greater ideal and we want to participate in it. And then, as if to assist and participate, they enter into the heart of the effort and subvert from within. Appearing to help, they sabotage from inside. And this, he says, is the last and greatest danger that a Gnostic community will have to face. In a sense, all three things happen all the time. But the priority and emphasis is different. From a certain historical perspective, if we look back at the last, we can say nearly 100 years since Sri Aurobindo declared the ideal of the life divine, we find at first quite a large mass of humanity ignoring, not openly ridiculing, but looking at it as something impossible, a pipe dream, something not even worth bothering about because it is so futuristic and so radical, so ambitious. Subsequently, we find cynical comments, even attempts to ridicule. But there has been a more obvious opposition only in recent times, relatively, in the last, let's say, 20 years, in different forms. And to me, that is also a sign that the ideal has already taken sufficient root in humanity that it is beginning to threaten the forces of the past. And then this kind of response starts. And the third phase of attempting to subvert is even now only superficially done. Much worse might happen. And in a sense, all of these stages, from the perspective of the spiritual effort, are really a means or an attempt, what Mother described as the battle of the past against the future. But from the spiritual perspective, they can be seen as permitted by the divine because they ensure the perfection and the strengthening of the spiritual realization and effort. Wherever there is a weakness, wherever there is an incompleteness, wherever a passage has been made hastily without sufficient consolidation, and a weakness is sensed, there the attacks would tend to come to try to spoil the work, but precisely the attack would partially succeed because there is a weakness. And it would force our effort to consolidate, strengthen, and overcome those limitations. But in this paragraph, Sri Aurobindo is not going so much into this aspect of the struggle, but just showing the difference of priority. And particularly, he shows that there are certain forms which may be common to institutions which have a conventional objective, a mundane, ordinary life objective, as well as institutions which have a spiritual objective but which are life-denying, as well as with institutions such as these, which have a spiritual objective which are life-transforming. So the form, external form may be common. In this case, he takes the example of the sports and physical activities. The external form may be common, but the internal objective is completely different. And therefore, the manner in which these things are done is also different. So he says, a divine life in the world or an institution having that for its aim and purpose cannot be or cannot remain something outside or entirely shut away from the life of ordinary men in the world or unconcerned with the mundane existence. It has to do the work of the divine in the world and not a work outside or separate from it. In fact, it is seen from a certain sense that certain spiritual experiences can be had so much more easily when we separate ourselves from the superficiality of life. A kind of a partial isolation is extremely useful to deepen and develop certain experiences. And that is often the justification for creating a gap. But more importantly, for the conventional spiritual institutions, life itself is seen as something not worthy of transforming or impossible to transform. So is not even taken up. For our purpose, since the goal is to take up that life and divinize it, a degree of isolation may be useful temporarily. But with the whole idea that whatever is gained must be brought back upon life to change that life. So it cannot remain entirely shut away, though some kind of separation is helpful. Or unconcerned with the mundane existence. Now, with this, just this one phrase, he suggests many things here. If something happens in the world which may affect the overall human evolution, we cannot say that, well, we have our life cut out here and our difficulties and we won't bother with it. We are concerned. And where necessary, we may have to intervene even to prevent or modify those dangerous movements or assist the forces of light to consolidate. An example here is of what happened during the Second World War. Sri Aurobindo has an interesting observation. He says, in the beginning when the war started, Sri Aurobindo and the mother did not concern themselves with it too much. They observed the circumstances, they saw the trends, but it is only when it seemed as if the forces of darkness would overwhelm the forces of light and delay evolution by 1,000 years, then they had to intervene. And when he says they had to intervene, it was also done at a great cost. There was, Mother observes, something very special building up around that time in the 2 years before the war. And it seemed as if the possibility of the new consciousness and the new world was imminent. And she says it is precisely to distract their concentration from that work, to force them into diluting that concentration, that the hostile forces began the Second World War. And because of that, Sri Aurobindo said, they had to turn all their energies towards the danger that humanity faced. And for that purpose, many things had to be, let's say, diluted or postponed in the concentration here. Even the influx of refugees which came changed the whole dynamics of the sadhana, and many things happened subsequently. But this is a very strong example of how the spiritual community cannot remain unconcerned with issues of the mundane existence. Mundane, the word, has an interesting use here. Mundane means ordinary or relating to the ordinary life or ordinary world, and the root sound itself comes from monde, that is world, worldly. But it's interesting that in the English language, when you say worldly or mundane, automatically in the word itself, one looks down at the world. One treats it as if something inferior, something not worthy of respect. So you say, oh, this is worldly interests. And in the very word is this sharp divide between the spiritual and the material or worldly. And mundane carries this sense. So such a community, an institution like this, with the aim and purpose of divine life in the world, cannot remain shut out or unconcerned with this mundane existence. So what's the thing it has to do? It has to do the work of the divine in the world. and not to work outside or separate from it. And straight away, that puts us head on into the battle of life. From a certain perspective, even the spiritual pursuit cannot separate itself from the battle of life. And that is why Sri Aurobindo gives so much importance to the Bhagavad Gita and the message of the Gita, that an entire book, essays on the Gita, had to be written, bringing out that message, because the Gita concerns itself with this problem of the battle of life and the spirituality and its role in that battle. As part of that otherworldly spirituality of the past, any engagement with life, and by extension any form of conflict or battle, was seen as unspiritual. And the spiritual man would always have to withdraw in the face of conflict, would always have to assert himself through weakness, meekness, poverty, even ugliness, because those were the symbols of spirituality. Mother says that is a perversion, and spirituality includes strength, harmony, beauty, power, knowledge, love, perfection. All of these are aspects of the divine and must be recovered for the divine work. So the battle of life itself requires us to prepare ourselves with not only wisdom, but also the strength to actualize that wisdom, but also to face battle. And in the thick of battle, even use the weapons of battle as necessary, even in expression of violence. Now here comes again a point where most spiritual traditions stand back in shock. How can violence be accepted in the spiritual life? Isn't that, after all, a distortion when we seek harmony and beauty and love? So that is why all the commentary is required on the Gita, and Sri Aurobindo deals with it extensively. He says, if our goal was to realize something of the transcendent Brahman, or something of the nirvanic experience, or the aspect of the negative aspect of Brahman, then it wouldn't matter. If there is a problem in the world, well, you withdraw even more. But because we want to bring a higher truth into life and transform life, there is a work to be done in life. Therefore, forces also align themselves to oppose the work of changing life. And we have to be able to counter those forces with force as necessary. But the difference is that the spiritual man, or the spiritual approach in the battle, will be one where psychologically one is free of distortion, of ego, desire, and even one can say, therefore, psychologically one is free of violence. In the action of the force itself, there has to be a violence when it deals with force against force. That is a violence. But psychologically, it is done without a personal interest, without the ego coming into the way, and without the consciousness being clouded by the conflict of force and the violence. Sri Aurobindo gives the example of those who speak of non-violence as an ideal of life. He says non-violence is a truth, yes, but it is not a truth of the material domain. It is a truth of the psychological domain. In the mind and in the heart, we should not have violence. It will be in a larger vision of a greater harmony and oneness and a higher truth that we will act. But when the action moves into the material domain, conflict of force against force is a law of the material world, and violence is an intrinsic part of it. Even if we eat food, it is causing violence to a plant, isn't it? There are those who have stood as examples of non-violent revolt, let's say. And Sri Aurobindo points out that they were never non-violent. He gives the example of Mahatma Gandhi when he fought with non-violence. He caused tremendous violence on an intellectual level, on a psychological level, even going on fast to blackmail the public or the colonial rulers. And that is a psychological violence. So he says, to prevent physical violence and you assert psychological violence is to reverse the priority. Rather, in the psychological consciousness, one has to be free of violence. On the material level, as needed, force against force will involve whatever conflict. These are all very important distinctions, all of which become critical when we accept the work in life, and therefore also the battle of life becomes a part of the spiritual sadhana. But this is just a kind of a sketchy summary of the key points which are involved. The moment we say it has to do the work of the divine in the world and not a work outside or separate from it. Then he gives an example. What we are attempting is not something radically new in that sense, that we are seeking to transform life. Such a thing has been there, was part of the Vedic ideal, and was in fact the form of relationship of the Vedic rishis with the life around. So he gives that as an example of the relationship, though the form may not be relevant today, but the principle is relevant. So he says, the life of the ancient rishis in their ashramas had such a connection. They were creators, educators, guides of men, and the life of the Indian people in ancient times was largely developed and directed by their shaping influence. When Sri Aurobindo established Sri Aurobindo Ashram in 1926, he made it a point to say that he uses the word ashram in the original Vedic sense of the word, and that is what is mentioned here. Modern usage of the word ashram is seen more as a sanctuary and a refuge from life, a cloister and a monastery. But the original sense of the word ashram, he says, meant house of the Guru, where the disciples come to learn and study under the Guru's guidance. And to study and learn what? If we go back to the examples from that period of Indian history, we see that when the kings had to prepare the princes and princesses for the most important responsibility of governance of an entire country, who did they send these children to for the training? They sent them to the rishis. And what did the rishis teach them? They taught them all the necessary skills of life, including the science of governance and administration and economics, management, the science of warfare and the use of specific weapons and training in those weapons, and even occult weapons, not just physical weapons. And along with it, all 64 arts. A person was not considered truly cultured unless he or she had mastered 64 arts. And mastered 64 arts. Imagine what that demands. And with that, of course, all the sciences and the philosophies which were intrinsic to the whole worldview, the Vedantic worldview. And then into that, whatever spiritual education would be possible for that age group or the person was ready for. This complete training was given by the rishis by them as examples. For example, they cannot teach the skillful use of weapons unless they themselves have that skill. You can't give a theoretical lecture and say, now you figure it out. So this demonstrates the kind of complete knowledge and mastery that these rishis had, and the kind of teaching that their ashrama involved. When you look at the scope of what Sri Aurobindo has put forth in the formation of the ashram and what Mother has declared in the formation of Auroville, you see something of this resonating, although with a very different vocabulary and in a very different form. When she says Auroville is meant to be a place of unending education and progress. Now here is a context set where one can even look at the whole space of Auroville township as being a kind of a university township as in the ancient days, where all of the knowledge, the best knowledge available at present is taken in, represented, but also all the forms of the future knowledge and future possibilities are experimented upon, developed, perfected to inspire the rest of the world. She made it a point when the ashram was being developed to say very clearly in these words. She said, when somebody complained to the mother and said, "Mother, this doesn't work, this is not how they do it outside." Mother would say, precisely because they do it like this outside, I don't want it repeated. That has been done there. Find a better way. Develop a new way. And she said even, I don't mind how many times you fail. Failure is not a problem. The point is to make a breakthrough in a new possibility. And failure is part of that. There is no scientist who can claim any meaningful progress without having had a very large number of failures. There was a medicine which was available for a long time, a patent medicine that was named 606. And our teacher explained to us that the number comes because the person who developed the medicine had to make attempts after attempts which failed and failed and failed. And it was the 606th attempt which worked. So he named the medicine 606. But that's just as an example. The point being, this is a laboratory where the spiritual consciousness is taking up the real life problems of the world and trying, as if in a laboratory in a relatively isolated space, to resolve those problems, testing to see how life responds to various kinds of attempts and forms. And then when something is successful, achieved, then it is rapidly spread out into the world. A lot of the experimentation is at the level of consciousness, in terms of changing human nature, facing our internal human limitations, overcoming them individually and collectively. For this purpose, necessarily, all the problems of the world must be represented here first. Otherwise, you cannot have a real, meaningful laboratory. And then naturally you will see the problems of the world being represented in a small space. It even seems that much more difficult because in the world, the same problems are spread out and so they are diluted. Here in a small community, when you represent all those problems, they suddenly appear exaggerated. Sri Aurobindo comments on this in one of his letters. He says that there is a reason for this. First of all, he says this is inevitable in a small community. Problems will be exaggerated. But here he says this exaggeration even serves a purpose. So in a sense, in the very design of the community, it is accepted that there will be such a thing. And he says it serves the purpose that the problem being exaggerated, you are forced to face it and resolve it, which is the whole point of this space. And this comment of his immediately puts in context so many things which appear strange to us in communities, both the ashram and in Auroville. In contrast to so many other spiritual ashramas or centers or communities, where the goal of transformation of life is not the objective, and where they have things seeming to happen at least so much more smoothly, so much more harmoniously and easily. But this background puts all that in context. The idea being, here is something where we set the prototype and then it extends into the world. So this is the way Sri Aurobindo describes the life of the ancient rishis in their ashramas and their connection with the world outside. So he says, they were creators, educators, guides of men and the life of the Indian people. So, creators, because things which are not yet in conventional life must first be brought here, realized. So, you're bringing down upon earth something of the future that is not yet born, which wants to take birth, which is pushing, against which there is resistance, there is even insufficient receptivity in humanity. But this is a center, a focal point where we are trying to create a special receptive space where it can get some foothold and some possibility to manifest. Once it manifests in this smaller representative humanity, then it can find its way in the rest of the world rapidly. So creators, because we bring in new things. Second, educators. When a new possibility is organized, consolidated, developed, perfected, then automatically it must be then extended into the larger domain of life, and there is as if a transmission of a teaching, whatever form it takes. It can be a most mundane material technology, or it can be a massive psychological shift, and this transmission still is involved. Sometimes the transmission is done overtly, but more often than not, especially in matters of consciousness, it takes place subliminally and covertly. I have seen a very interesting relationship in the, let's say, the student life in the ashram community and the rest of India, particularly in the younger groups. I've seen a relationship spanning about 20 years, I can say, where certain developments took place here, which were significant in that they were new, they were certain shifts of mindset, and then subsequently, often involving a gap of about 2 to 3 years, I would see the same pattern widespread in the student communities or generally youth in India. I did not have during that time exposure to spaces outside India, so I can't say much about that. But at least this correspondence I have seen, even including the shift of language. There was an interesting passage in the development of the ashram student culture where there used to be for decades a mix of Hindi, Bengali, English as the common language among students. And then at some point, with one generation, with one particular batch, it just shifted to English. And it was as if all the other vernacular languages were set aside, became secondary. And with that batch, every successive batch had that same shift. Small fluctuations. 3 years later, we saw a massive shift in the whole of India, where parents began to put their children in English medium schools, preferring them over vernacular schools. Now, this is not necessarily a healthy thing, but the point I'm making is there was a correspondence. And I'm giving this as one example. There were many other things, particularly in relation to mindset. And we could see, for example, in a particular passage, there was a very strong remnant of the colonial training and colonial influence on the Indian mind. And I was observing how, with a particular batch, the whole thing was shifting rapidly. It shifted over a span of about 3 or 4 years. It was just a small group in the whole students' community. But after that took place, I could see it rapidly extend, not in the same form, but just as a shift of mind within our school. And then within 2 or 3 years, I saw the movement widely in the younger groups, younger ages within India. So many things of this nature, which I have had the, let's say, the good fortune to observe, there seem to me very important shifts taking place, which are part of the larger occult and spiritual objective of these concentrated, transforming communities. There are many such things happening also in the larger adult life of the community, both in Auroville and in the ashram. One can see sometimes reflections of these things. Sometimes they are obvious, sometimes not so obvious. But often it is these subtle, subjective and psychological shifts which are the most important. Just as an example, if you go back about 50 years, the mindset of humanity always thought in terms of its national interests. The thinking was always my country's interests versus another country's interests. There was nothing in the educational system, nothing in the government, nothing in international politics, which even attempted to bring the idea of global village or one humanity. That shift of mindset took place in spite of all existing systems and structures. But when it did take place, it was seen first in the younger generations, but when they grew older, it suddenly burst upon the world in the institutional framework, because these very people became, let's say, they began to run the institutions, and then automatically institutional policies shifted. The old policies, which were framed in the context of self-interest and national interest, suddenly seemed so outdated. When new policies were drafted, there was nobody to oppose their global perspective, because everywhere that shift had taken place. And this kind of a change is a silent revolution. You do not see signs of it, you do not see people making demonstrations, and it just happens, and then we don't know when or how. It just happened so smoothly. It's just when you look back, you say, oh, there's a shift, I didn't even realize. These are the most important changes. And a lot of these shifts of mindset are part of the work that has to be done and is being done here. If we are conscious, we can make it happen faster. In another example which comes to mind, this was during the Second World War, when there was a very serious economic crisis in the whole world. Obviously, that reflected also in the ashram life. And Mother used to set the example. Envelopes which would come, the letters addressed to her, the same envelopes would be turned inside out and reused for sending letters. Every single thing was recycled, every single thing, no exception. Nothing was wasted. Even the soap which is used by sadhaks, the last piece that remains, when you cannot hold it in your hand anymore, it slips. Well, most people would tend to throw it away at that point. Those pieces would be gathered together and mixed to produce new bars of soap. And this was the example she personally set, and the whole community was as if taken up and made conscious of this and made to participate. And at some point, Mother commented that she has to do all these things because she said, I am responsible for the world's economy. The full import of that is much more, but on a more superficial level, what she did in her own immediate circle had its impact everywhere, but also in her own consciousness, where she held the whole community in her heart as a part of her own physical consciousness. when that change is brought about, it has a much wider impact. So many such things are part of the change which has been, let's say, influenced upon the larger humanity. She even went to the extent of saying each person living here is a representative of a human type and often also of a human problem of that type. And when that person is able to make the breakthrough in his personal consciousness and growth, then that whole type in humanity is helped and experiences some shift of that type. So there is this whole sharing that goes on. Although here the formal role of educator, which was obvious for the rishis in their ashramas, is not so obvious here, except in matters of technology. There is still the same relationship in consciousness. And finally, he uses the word also guides of men. We saw something of this in the role that Sri Aurobindo and the mother themselves played in relation to so many living all over the world, but also something of that continuing in the immediate generation after them. These were, many of them, giants in their own right. Standing before the mother and Sri Aurobindo, everybody was a child, and so we never saw them as unusual until they passed on, and we had to face the more ordinary humanity. And then we look back and look at those people and say, oh, they were such extraordinary people. Mother commented once that every single person who has been, it was Sri Aurobindo who commented, every single person who has been brought to the ashram, this is at that time in the 30s and 40s, every single person, had he been outside, would have been seen as a great guru. But here, because of the context in which we are, they are completely submerged in the larger effort, and you do not see them as so exceptional. They do not stand out so much, because that's the nature of the sadhana also. But had they been outside, they would have been great gurus. I think Mother makes such a comment also. And we have seen that in a few people who left for whatever reason and chose to settle outside, they each one became great spiritual and otherwise teachers, preceptors, gurus, guides, as he mentions here. But while they were here, it's as if all those things are flattened out, because that's not the role they're supposed to play here. Here the role is different. So that, nevertheless, psychologically that relationship has been there throughout, overtly or covertly. So as a result, the rishis not only influenced the life of the Indian people, but also, he says it was largely developed and directed by their shaping influence. And looking back, Sri Aurobindo observes that the whole type of the Indian culture was set by the Vedic rishis. They were so few in number. And yet what they held as their experience had a powerful imprint on the whole civilization and set in motion a certain turn of consciousness which lasted at least 10,000 years, still present. And whatever may have been cycles and fluctuations of priorities, the core movement was not lost. Such was the power of their impact. And I would say, looking to the future, such will be also the impact of what Sri Aurobindo has given the world in terms of his seminal writings. And I always keep saying, we are still too close to the event of their manifestation on earth to realize what a powerful impact it has had. Because the very descent on earth, avatara means descent, the very descent on earth has shifted things so massively that it seems to us as if that shift was part of the normal evolution. It is not. if you look back at the last, whatever, 2,000-3,000 years, you see how slowly things have moved, how little progress has been made, and how long the cycles of change are. And then when you look back at the last 100 years, you see such a rapid progress and such a large number of seething possibilities, ideas, energies, efforts, experiments, attempts, whatever the failures or successes. Such a diverse and rich, energetic effort bubbling everywhere, all over the world. It's not normal, it's not evolutionary, it is revolutionary. And it is the impact of that avatarana, the manifestation on earth of their presence. That is what Sri Aurobindo meant when he spoke of the hour of God, when even a little effort produces great results and changes destiny. And in contrast, he says, the other are spaces of time when much labor goes to the making of a little result. And it is this contrast which we see when we look back the last 1,000 years and the last 100 years. But it will be this which we may also see 200 or 300 years from now when we look back. We will see this as this extraordinary peak after which there was almost as if a relapse from exhaustion. Maybe not a collapse, but a momentary relapse before perhaps to consolidate all that has happened, the rich experience that humanity has had to pass through before a new surge can emerge from that. And its impact and what he has written will stand as inspiration for, I would say, the world culture for the next 1,000 years, at least. Sri Aurobindo is very realistic even in terms of what he envisages as the time span for the divinization of life itself in humanity. And in one of the very last chapters in the Life Divine, he even says, if you look at the goal we have set, that of transforming human nature itself, it may seem as if it's a very far-off ideal. It may seem as if it's not even worth talking about. It is so difficult and so distant. And so all this which we are discussing seems too premature or too ambitious. And he says, but we have to remember that perfection which we seek in human nature itself, the transformation, is innate within human nature. It's already within us, waiting as a seed and a potential and as an inevitable outcome. And if you recognize that, then all those arguments of time and difficulty, they begin to fade away. I somehow could not get the exact texts immediately, but this is the sum and substance of what he says there. So the impact of those rishis being what it was then, that example is very applicable to the present context. The life of the ancient rishis in their ashramas had such a connection between the spiritual and the so-called mundane life. They were creators, educators, guides of men, and the life of the Indian people in ancient times was largely developed and directed by their shaping influence. And this is the shaping influence. It does not get into details. It shapes the larger movements and directions, priorities. The life and activities involved in the new endeavor are not identical, but they too must be an action upon the world and a new creation in it. So it's not the same thing as the rishis and their influence. It's not identical, but still the action is upon the world. It must have contacts and connections with it and activities which take their place in the general life and whose initial and primary objects may not seem to differ from those of the same activities in the outside world. So 3 things are mentioned here. This life within the community, it must have contacts with the outer world. Second, it must have connections. Now this is more than contacts. And then It must have activities which take their place in the general life, whose initial and primary objects may not seem to differ, but their deeper objectives are quite different. So 3 degrees, and you'll see how it goes from a very superficial to even an imitation or an appearance of the same form. So the first level is a contact, where there is a touch of the consciousness. Necessarily at first the points of contact will be those where externally there is the greatest receptivity for the new consciousness, and where the point of contact can be also a point of influence for the higher consciousness to impact the organized life there. Both Sri Aurobindo and the mother have various observations of how they were conscious of specific people doing specific work all over the world in their larger cosmic consciousness, and how they were also helping, assisting, and inspiring them in their various movements. In one particular case, there is a mention by name. Sri Aurobindo refers to the example of Coué. This was a Frenchman, I believe, who established a form of healing which was based on self-affirmation, with a statement going something like, every day as I watch, I am getting better and better, and whatever variation of form. I see. Okay. And it was a very popular movement, very widely influential at that time, at its time. Many were helped, influenced, and even radically healed from extremes of illnesses, including physical ailments. And at least for the time that it lasted, it awakened a certain faith in the power of the, let's say, the inner faith or inner conviction to overcome any outer difficulty. Regarding Coué, Mother Sri Aurobindo mentions that Mother and Sri Aurobindo knew of him. Mother was actively helping him in his work, although they did not know him by name. And when somebody described him to them by name, they immediately recognized the person upon whom they had been working. Now, this is a very interesting glimpse of the kind of things that they were involved in. Here is a person who is open. In her cosmic consciousness, the mother feels this potential, this possibility. She projects an inspiration. He is seized by that, expresses it in forms which are natural to his temperament and nature. As his work progresses, she is aware of the spreading influence, the quality of influence and energy, how it is shaping, affecting humanity. She puts a special force to assist, support, and even extend that influence. And all the while, they know him inside out, as the supramental consciousness knows always inside out. And the outermost part, of course, is the name. And one doesn't bother, that doesn't matter. I don't care what his name is, I know him, that's all that matters. And they push to create that. He will never know them by name, but he will feel a power and a help and an inspiration. If he is sufficiently conscious, he may even know that it comes from beyond. If he is not conscious, he will feel it as his own power, his own strength or greatness, and that's it. But the work is done. And this is one example in what was a semi-medical field, let's say. Equally are examples in the technical field, in the scientific, in the artistic, philosophical, various such. There is one philosopher, a Christian mystic philosopher, who also spoke of evolution. What is his name? Would you be able to remind me? Not Gebser? I think Europe, maybe Gebser, the name slips, but well known as from the Christian mystical tradition, speaking of evolution. Eckhart, I am not too sure. No. Anyway, but he makes a specific mention that the ideas which he expressed were not his own. He was conscious that he received them from outside, that there was a source that transmitted them to him, and he only gave them form and expression. And subsequently, he, I believe, expressed affinity with Sri Aurobindo's thought. Unfortunately, I don't have the exact details, but this was one example which was frequently quoted by my teacher, MP Pandit. So there were such examples even in those fields, and I'll share with you one more example. It's a bit of a digression, it's just a few sentences, but they have so much importance. This is the example of Nikola Tesla as a scientist. And some of the ideas which he expressed were so radical, so far-seeing, that it even seems as if he could be considered as a vibhuti, who brought into the domain of science certain very futuristic possibilities and, I will say, realizations far ahead of their time. And so far ahead that within a span of about 10 or 15 years, he had finished his life's work. Everything else he did was too far ahead, and he even kept it secretive. Subsequently, in studying his life, in those more secretive parts, I found that he was involved in certain series of experiments which he never spoke of. He never explained why he was doing them. But what he did in those experiments corresponded very closely, almost identically, to passages from Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, where he discusses the triple soul forces and the warped echo from below, the tamasic, rajasic, and sattvic ego rebelling and speaking. And in those passages, we have, particularly with the vital and mental ego, the statements of achievements of science. I have done this, I have achieved this, I will do this, I will achieve that. And those series of statements summarize key developments in science, not all of which are obvious even today in the scientific domain, but those are exactly the experiments which Tesla was involved in. And even in his patents, I discovered that Tesla refers to the Vedantic thought. He met Swami Vivekananda, was deeply influenced by him, spent hours listening to his lectures when he didn't have time for anything else, any other socializing. And he was one of those that Swami Vivekananda assigned the task of proving that matter is equal to energy. The two are same. And Tesla said he did prove it in whatever way, well before Einstein. And subsequently, Swami Vivekananda remembers him also as an exceptional being. When he came back in India, he referred to him in one of his lectures as an exceptional scientist. Subsequently, I found, and this is not part of the normal biographical knowledge of Tesla's life, he was reading books of Vedanta and of Buddhism, sharing them with another very famous scientist, William Crook from England. They were exchanging these books on Vedantic texts and were referring to them in their scientific study and speculation of electromagnetism and gravity. And in one of the patents, Tesla makes a comment. He says, the current explanation of relativity and quantum mechanics is wrong. The only explanation valid for the appearance of matter is the ancient Hindu Vedic description of an Akasha and a prana working upon the Akasha to create forms out of that ether. Now he uses the Sanskrit words also. And all of his theories and all of his experiments were based on this idea of Akasha and Prana, ether and Vayu. We'll change the tape. When reading those passages in Savitri, with the warped echo and its claim and hopes for the future, I thought at first that these were just a coverage of the various tendencies and claims of science. But it struck me later that there had to be some representative type some person who would embody that particular consciousness. That's how nature works. And when studying these aspects of Tesla's experiments, I found the closest similarity there. One example Sri Aurobindo mentions there is making water hard as stone and iron soft as velvet. Now, one can take this generally, purely as being able to make one material reveal qualities which are opposite to it, which is actually the ultimate achievement of science, to draw out the very opposite qualities from whatever material. Tesla actually experimented with water under enormous pressure, so enormous that the canister in which the pressure, steel canister, at one point exploded. But from that steel canister under which the pressure was built into some literally thousands of pounds per square inch, a jet of water would shoot out, and he was doing some experiments with it. And one of the things he did, he would take a steel rod and hit this stream of water with his steel rod. The water at that pressure had characteristics harder than steel. So his steel rod would bang against the water with a clang and bounce back. And this is just a thin jet of water. Why he did this to this day, he has never explained. Nobody knows also. But we have records that he did this experiment and a few other such things. So I just give this as an example to indicate that in the work that they did of imprinting certain possibilities in humanity, they touched every single field. And that work was not limited to just this community. This community was as if a focal point for the most important part of the change in terms of consciousness. For the development of the forms, it was as if spread out through so many ready instruments who, I would say, had taken birth at that time in the presence of the avatar to participate in this, and became as if vibhutis at that point for certain particular lines of development. We see, for example, in the life of Tesla, every single lecture which he made, he had to bring in some new scientific discovery. He said, I never repeat the same lecture and I never demonstrate the same experiment twice. If I do a new lecture, I must do a new experiment with a new discovery which has so far not been made. And then only I will do something new, otherwise I won't do it. And literally within those 10 or 15 years, all of the major developments which are part of conventional life today, involving electricity and electronics, were discovered by him. Everything ranging from the tube light, neon light, the CFL bulb, to robotics, remote control, transmission of radio waves, transmission of energy through electromagnetic transmission, something which has not yet been fully replicated. Particle beam weapons, what is later development, which is called Star Wars, laser beams, etc. Those types of developments. And most important, the future source of energy, which is the ability to tap the pranic energy and the ether to generate electricity. All of these things he had accomplished, demonstrated, and all the key insights were spread out in his patents, literally going into hundreds of patents. When he died, about 14 crates of his notes and ideas were seized by the US government, of which one crate was released, which was relatively his older notes, and which were given to his family. They have not yet brought out everything still, but that was way back in 1943, I think. To this day, what the bulk of those 14 crates which the US government seized at that time, to this day they are treated by the US government as classified with national security implications. That means they involved technologies which today would be considered dangerous to be revealed to the world for national security reasons. Good, amazing stuff. But he spoke of what his ideas were and what he claimed he had already achieved. And those are not yet available. But what I'm pointing out here is the Vibhuti anticipates and sets the type for the future, just as more obviously Leonardo da Vinci anticipated most of the modern forms of technologies in his time, well before his time. Tesla was even conscious that he had crossed the limits of what was possible in his time and made these comments that all of his later works, he said, they are for the future of humanity. Today people oppose him, but a day will come when his technology will be the future. So this is just to go back to summarize that so many things have been brought forward, and the impact of it is still to gradually reveal, unveil, unfold over the coming few centuries. We don't even know the full import of and power of what they have done in these few years. So just as the ancient rishis largely developed and directed the whole civilization by their shaping influence, so it will be, we will see in time to come, the impact of Sri Aurobindo's manifestation on earth. But now we come back to the description. The points of contact which had to be established, through which things would be spread. And then the second, he says, connections. Now, a connection is not a point of contact, but an active, two-way, constant flow where you can say even the influence or consciousness is established elsewhere. As, for example, we have today centers where people gather, read together, study together, practice together, share on a spiritual level, form a small, I will say, nucleus of a community. I won't call it community, but I'll say nucleus of a community. And around which maybe in another 50 years, even a community might develop. As in many places, we do see the first signs of communities forming, inspired in this way. And these become not just points of contact, but connections. And we have seen that some of the early connections established by Sri Aurobindo in various points in the world, in India, elsewhere, in Europe, in the US, became, so to say, points through which a very large number of possibilities were seeded. Often it was one person in a nucleus of a community forming around, and then one sees across generations the impact spreading. And then, activities whose initial and or primary objects may not seem to differ from those of the same activities in the outside world. And Mother made it a point, she said, to represent all of the important activities of human life in the ashram community. Now, considering that it was an ashram that would be considered by many to be sacrilegious, Mother started businesses. She started industries, and people will say, what's this? Is this an ashram or it's another kingdom? Well, that was the work to be done. I'll come to that, the details of that later. But you see then when she extends the scope of that work to Auroville, where now you have not an ashram but an entire township, where you have the same principle of everything out there being represented here, preferably in terms of the highest possibilities of human aspiration or culture. And the pavilions of which she spoke of so much, representing all the cultures of the world and their highest realizations and achievements. You see how important they become. And then the setting up of industries and all the other activities of life, seen in its nucleus form in the ashram and seen in it the extension that Auroville is meant to still realize fully. We see something interesting there. Miniature worlds being created. But in those miniature worlds, new values established in those nucleus forms. So, when the first business was started, owned by the ashram or started by very close devotees in the ashram, the names she gave was Honesty. Now, there are 3 businesses, all of which are named Honesty. Honesty General Stores, Honesty Electricals, honesty engineers and contractors, and another honesty of another for another general stores. Four, I think. So all of these four different businesses all named honesty. And you wonder why. Didn't she have imagination to name them differently? Precisely because that was the principle she wanted to establish in the domain of business. Because unfortunate reality of business was at that time that compromise and taking advantage of the buyer, dishonesty in some form, was considered normal. Even the buyer assumed that the businessman was dishonest to whatever extent, some less, some more. But that culture of dishonesty was considered the norm in business. And that has to be reversed. And honesty has to become the dominant culture. We should assume that it's honest, and dishonesty should be the exception rather. It's not yet tilted fully, but certainly a lot has changed from that time till now. And it's been hard work, but she set that type. When Auroville started its first school, she named it Last School. And that was a very strong message. Then they made the next school. So the second school, they went to the mother, what will you name it? She named it After School. And then the third school started, and she named it No School. There is, in fact, around the world, in very small pockets, the no schooling movement, which is coming up, where parents want to raise their children with homeschooling, so to say, or even community sharing of it, but not as formal schools. It's still too radical even to be accepted widely, but it's there in small pockets. But here in this seed space, that was the idea which she has hammered in. It's a different matter that somehow human nature and human inertia, let's say, finds it too difficult, too radical to make that leap. And although we call it whatever, Last School, No School, whatever name, eventually, inevitably, the old forms of schooling creep in. And it's such a struggle. The people who lived that ideal in the early period, say in Auroville, who really lived that new educational approach, still don't understand how at some point there was some problem and then there was this huge invasion and they don't know how. It was not people, it is forces. It is forces of the status quo which suddenly realize, you see, as long as you're doing an experiment, they don't worry. Make all the experiments you want. As long as you don't disturb our domain, they're fine. But when the experiment gathers roots and it starts influencing and it threatens their control, domain, and their rule, then they immediately rush to smother it. And that's what happened. Forces rush in, suddenly it clouds, suffocates, creates conflict, confusion, poof, it's gone. How did it go? You can't even understand, because it was not people. People were just occasion, nimitta. It's the force which did it, and people were toys in front of it. In one of the paintings of Savitri, some passage from Savitri, Mother made Huta draw this, where she showed these giant beings, not necessarily divine, even asuric, tossing human beings like little dolls, like that, across, throwing them around, playing with them. That's the kind of power that they have to influence even on a mass scale. And that's part of the battle. The great battle of the future that is to be born against the past that seeks to endure. This is one of her famous prayers. So that the new things may manifest and we be ready to receive them. And she says, make of us the hero warriors that we aspire to become. May we fight successfully the great battle of the future that is to be born against the past that seeks to endure, so that the new things may manifest and we be ready to receive them. So make of us the hero warriors. That's the prayer. But this is part of the game. And even for her, she knew these things happened. She knew these things would happen. She knew even when individuals came who represented those very opposing forces. Just as there are vibhutis for the divine action, there are also vibhutis for the asuric action. She knew and she identified some of them also, sometimes in private moments, speaking to her confidants. She would point out X, Y, Z. And then she made some general statements. Sri Aurobindo also says how Mother has kept some very powerful asuric beings in the ashram under her influence so that they may not do too much harm outside, and to work upon them to try to change them, transform their allegiance. And then Sri Aurobindo makes a comment saying, so far she has not been very successful. It's just a passing comment, but we do know of a few cases where there was a remarkable shift in the allegiance. And the very same, what we would call asuric beings, became the instruments through which she built the whole institutional infrastructure of the ashram. The more divine beings are too soft and meek and weak to do the hard force that requires tremendous vitality. And that vitality, which is natural to a titanic being, is necessary for certain types of large creations. And she did it through them. She used them as those instruments. So there was certainly something extraordinary that she achieved, which is unheard of in human history. Asuric beings being used to build the infrastructure for a divine construction. It's something unusual. So these are some examples of how she took forms of institutions outside, created focal points of them as, for example, business or research or music or arts, into which she infused this new possibility. So when it came to dance, for example, we had the main dance teacher, Anuben. She used to tell us that Mother always emphasized a shift away from the more stylized dance forms, because those have a certain value, they're good for training, but the future is a free, spontaneous expression in form directly from a fluid, from an inspiration working through a fluid instrument. So to train the instrument, you may use any kind of training and of stylized dances, but this fluid and free expression in form was what she was trying to encourage. And of a certain quality which manifests the psychic and the spiritual, not the vital and the dramatic. You see, a stage performer is impressive when they have the vital expression. And even the vital can be an instrument for a more spiritual influence. But still, the dominant expression is through the vital. She wanted the psychic movement to be brought forward in dance form. Now, this is something which is very difficult and rare. It's not even been attempted from that sense, consciously. And here it's what she wanted to bring in consciously. And the same with music and with painting. When she was training Huta for the painting of the Savitri paintings, which you see here, and some of other poems of Sri Aurobindo, she took her from a raw novice stage with no experience of painting, taught her everything from the basic sketching of outlines to the mixing of colors, to the application of different types of materials, different methods and techniques for painting, and building slowly to what she wanted her to achieve. At some point she said, I will paint through your hands. And that's how she worked through Huta subsequently. But the amount of time and training that she gave for something so simple, one would wonder. There were so many other great artists in the ashram who had come from the great artistic schools, having been trained under experts. They had all the necessary skills. She could have used them. Or she could have got them to train her. She refused to allow any of them to interact with her, even to the extent of telling Huta, you will not even look at other paintings. Everything you do must be purely in this inspiration. Once, just once, Huta did a painting where she copied from another painting. And mother was furious. She said, who told you to do this? Why did you do this? I've told you never to touch those things. And she made her erase all that and destroy it. She did not want even a little bit of contamination of those forms or those inspirations. And then once she commented to Huta, she said, I tried with so many people, and she named a few of the expert artists of the ashram. And she said they were too fixed in their training. In their consciousness, there was some kind of a fixation, and there was not the necessary fluidity that she wanted for the new forms to manifest. And that's why she said she had to start from scratch with Huta. And it was something similar that she attempted with the music from Sunilda. And with him also she made this comment that she said, I will play through your hands. And Sunilda was very conscious, and to the end, he remained always very transparent. There was never this assertion of the individual ego ever in any interactions. He was also a teacher of physics, I believe. But all through, he never allowed his own personality to ever come forward. And that's why you can see the purity of the inspiration in his music. Even I had one occasion, I think it was soon after he passed away, that I had been to the room where the instruments were kept, and I was given the chance to play on his organ. I was at the time much more sensitive, and I could feel as if there was something different there, and I could not play on them without feeling it something sacred, and I was as if violating that sacred thing by playing on it. But these are the kinds of things, and there were so many others, working on the physical consciousness, for example, in different people, certain possibilities which she saw, and she pushed in each one those possibilities to an extreme. One man, for example, represented a possibility of the physical body to become enormously supple. He grew up as a young boy in the ashram. He read books of asanas and just did the asanas spontaneously. And mother encouraged him freely. And he would, to his late age, he lived to be in the 80s. To the last, he could do all of those asanas involving the greatest flexibility and strength required. Ambu Bhai. And he was an unusual person. We had a few interviews with him. And even in his late 80s, he was like a young 8-year-old, 9-year-old, full of enthusiasm and like a child, bubbling with all kinds of stories and enthusiasm. Something quite unusual, difficult to characterize, but something in the consciousness to bring that youth and plasticity down into the physical consciousness. That's how I felt it when I had that interaction. And each person had some potential of some kind upon which she worked. Some in this way were positive potential, some were also people with representing specific problems, whose work in that life was to overcome those problems. So this is the kind of representation of human problems and consciousness, but also now we were actually coming to the forms of life. I spoke of businesses, I spoke of dance, music, painting, but in every activity that she started, she tried to bring in that inner consciousness. So when it was the gardening, one would wonder why in an ashram we need to bring so many flowers and have so many gardens. Mother gave so much importance to cultivating plants in the right consciousness, relating to them with the right consciousness, touching the deeper psychic and spiritual dimension in nature and bringing that forward. So I will give here 3 examples One was Parichand, who was the head gardener. There was something deeply psychic in his sensitivity, and all those who had interaction with him. Like I said, these were all giants. We never saw them as such because everybody was so great. But there was something deeply psychic about him, and the plants which he would cultivate would be unusual. He would be able to grow things which normally are not grown in this climate. He would be conscious also of the presences within those plants and the nature spirits being part of them. And at some point, when there were problems with certain gardens, he approached the mother with certain solutions which came to him more intuitively. And though they were unusual, mother accepted them. This was one person through whom she did some work. There were two other places which were gardens, which subsequently in the last 20 years, unfortunately, have been destroyed to make housing colonies. I thought a very crude, unfortunate outcome. But those plots were areas where mother had instructed in detail certain individuals to plant which plant where, involving which flower and which symbolism, how to plant, what to do in minute detail, and she was putting her force in that patch where the plants were being cultivated. At some point in the mid-50s, I believe, mother declared that finally nature has accepted to collaborate. Now, this is a very important statement. So far, whatever work was being done of transformation of nature did not have the support of general nature, mother nature, let's say. And there's a point where she managed to get that support and collaboration from mother nature. And there's a message she gave around that time, which was published, which she made like a public declaration of that collaboration. And she said something in the message, it goes, and there is no end to the wonders of that collaboration. Now, what scope it was she worked on through these people and others, unfortunately, I do not see too many people today who have that kind of even sensitivity, or at least that is not supported anymore. But during that period, just after, when she was experimenting to see how far that collaboration could be taken, one of the devotees, businessmen, was starting a sugar factory. He had purchased the plot of land, they were doing the work, and she sent ashram inmates to work on that property, the ashram engineer to go there to assist in setting up the sugar factory, ashram students working to do the measurements of the plot and doing the whole mapping and things like that. And you would wonder why. And it's because she was trying to bring in this different consciousness into that factory, business, whatever form it was. And then after all that initial work was done, they needed water. So they were digging, and there were many attempts made by the conventional ways. Each one of them failed. Finally, this person who was starting the business came to the mother and said, we are not getting enough water, we can't do it. So mother asked him to bring a map of that land, and then she concentrated for a while and then made a mark on the map and said, dig here. Now, by the conventional methods, they said you will not get water there. But when actually they dug, they hit water which was under so much pressure that it burst out from the ground. And to this day, it continues to be a gushing stream. They have never had lack of water in that, just from that one point. And this mother took as an experiment. She made a comment on this. She said that whole setting up of that project was for her an experiment to test the collaboration with nature to see how far it could be taken. Then when the machinery started working, they found repeated breakdowns. And again, mother was referred to it. So she concentrated for a while, and then she said, the sugarcane which is being crushed for the juice, the vital energy which is released from the crushing of the sugarcane is coming towards the machinery in anger. And that is what is destroying the machinery. And then she said she made an occult formation that the very same vital energy which is released was now turned to protect the machinery. And after that, all the breakdowns stopped. And then literally, it's been running for decades with practically no problems. Unfortunately, that devotee subsequently sold off the factory to some other businessman, and it's no more now under, let's say, the ashram's influence. Earlier, it was at least in her influence directly. But this is an example, and she specifically mentioned this as one of the cases of testing the collaboration with nature. So you see, in every activity that was replicated, the form may be the same as in the general life, but the objective for which this is being done, the priority with which it's being done, the consciousness which is being brought in, the transformation of life which is being attempted is the difference. And that's what he is referring to. So it must have the spiritual community, it must have contacts and connections with it, the world outside, and activities which take their place in the general life, and whose initial or primary objects may not seem to differ from those of the same activities in the outside world. But actually they are very different. One could take many other examples. One more I will end with. When the Udarda was setting up the workshop and steel making unit, part of the Harpagon workshop, Mother came and concentrated on each one of the machines. And she said she tried to connect the machines to the higher spiritual force. Now this is the most material machinery, is literally the inconscience dynamized, literally. And most significantly was one machine which was a steel shaping, steel press, where bowls, plates were shaped. And you see the symbolism there. There's this huge thing pressing from above, and a steel plate is put, and the thing presses and shapes steel. Steel is the hardest metal, shaped by something pushing down from above. And into this she has made that connection with the spiritual force. And imagine what happens. Every piece of material that comes out as a production from there would have some imprint of what she has put there as a spiritual and occult formation. Unfortunately, again, in the last 10 years, they have sold off many of those machines, including this one. I feel very sad to see these losses, because they are a loss on a spiritual level, not on a material level. If it was just another workshop set up as a machinery, replace them, buy the vessels, what difference does it make? It's more efficient to buy. But when you see it as part of a spiritual exercise to change things in the domain of life, then it's a sacred space, and there's something significant for the world's future which is being worked upon, even if the people working there are not fully conscious of it. Then he gives one specific example.
Yes. The question isn't there an effort needed to inform the people what happened and trying to get it back? I mean, other efforts outside might they also be.
That's part of the problem, unfortunately. You see, people can be informed, and they have been. I was born well after many of these events took place, but there has been sufficient transmission within the community that at least some of these things are known to a few people. It's part of the education, really. It's part of the education, and it's also part of human nature. You see, the example I gave earlier of the invasion that took place in the educational space within Auroville, and how the original clarity and purity of the effort suddenly being subverted in spite of the best efforts. It's not the fault of the people. It's a part of the battle that we are dealing with. And it's something similar we see here. Even if you educate What happens at some point is there is this invasion of forces which use whatever situation, minds, human interests to subvert things.
Especially with the old metal working, like
Yes.
in Golkon, we find a lot
Yes.
of things which are radiating. And the other time when I went in Hapagong, I saw an old machine and it's just radiate.
Yes, you felt that. In fact, those are the machines that Mother concentrated on. Yes, one can feel even now. Golconda was an example. You see, Golconda was made, it's one of those extraordinary buildings in the world. It was made over a span of more than 10 years. And Mother's instructions were take as long as it takes, spend as much as it takes, but I want it perfect. Now, nobody ever does that. Nobody, no businessman ever does that for a building. However great, however wonderful. They all say, here's your budget, here's your deadline. Here is somebody saying, spend all you want, take as long as you want. And the other side is, every single piece is custom made. Whether it is a piece of, say, this concrete blocks, whether it is the asbestos sheeting, whether it is the metal parts, everything is custom made at that time to this day surviving. And even they made spares for the next 100 years. And everything continues from that time. The machinery which made it, as I said, unfortunately, much of it has been discarded. But that spirit is what should have survived. The machinery still is secondary. That's not by itself a great loss. The spirit being lost is the greatest loss. And it is important for us, while we are still fresh with the memory of what she did then, to imbibe that spirit and try to bring it back in our own little pockets within the community. In context of the number of people and this battle and challenges, Mother made this comment. You see, in the beginning when Aurobindo was just a few, less than 100 people, she said, you have many problems? Yes, that's because you are still a small number. Wait until it becomes 20,000 people, then your problems will be less. Because it dilutes. What we discussed earlier, when in a small space you bring the representation of the world's problems to be solved, everything gets exaggerated. The moment you increase the numbers, then the problems, so to say, get diluted in the numbers and things become so much easier. And I believe things will still happen. We still have that chance. But in the larger number also, there's the possibility of dilution of the spirit. So what is critical at this point, both in Aurobindo and in the ashram, is for small pockets, again I will say not community, but nucleus within community. Small pockets to imbibe that spirit and within our particular space try to bring back those values of the psychic and the spiritual into every tiniest detail of life. Bring in the higher knowledge, bringing the higher power, bringing the harmony and the perfection and the beauty and the love and the attitude of consecration, everything which is part of the sadhana, down into the tiniest detail of what we do. And Golconda I took as an example of how she tried to bring that into this building, to make it not as a standing example of the physical form of the building, but as an inspiration of the spirit in which the whole building was done. And that's the example really which she wants to propagate. In contrast, I had just not as criticism, but as an example of how the inertia of humanity overwhelms eventually. When at some point there was a housing problem. You see, Aurobindo faces pretty much the same problems which the ashram faced in the early days. And Mother anticipated all those problems, gave instructions. In spite of that, we didn't follow them. So even with the buildings in the ashram, Mother said, buy them up right now. And she said, even if you have to pay extra, buy them up now. Later you won't be able to buy them. And the people who did there, for haggling over 400 rupees, they lost entire buildings. And of course, later on, those very buildings which were on rent were taken back by the owners. The ashram community was forced away from the ashram space. You see, occultly and spiritually, it's a great damage. If you have all the people living in the same space, it creates a physical presence of protection. The ashram people were pushed out, and instead businesses and other things came around the ashram main building, pushing their diluting influence, which is very damaging. And the ashram inmates were then given buildings which were constructed on the same gardens where Mother had worked to bring nature's beauty into that space. And those gardens were wiped out. But the buildings which were made, and they were made in the late 80s, when my teacher, MP Pandit, went to the first of those buildings, it was called New Creation, he came back and said, glorified barracks. Glorified barracks. Barracks are those little cubby holes where the army soldiers stay. It's just made functional, you squeeze in somehow and you live, and that's the army life. And you call it New Creation, but he said glorified barracks. Too small, cubby hole, not at all aesthetic, ugly buildings. But, well, that's human nature or the inertia of the past asserting itself, and that's part of the battle. And I would hope that someday they would be rebuilt, or new buildings at least would be done more in the spirit of what Mother had already established, because the force she has established is still present. When it receives instruments, it flows and connects down to the most material level in life and acts then directly in life. When instruments refuse or are not available, then the force is as if disconnected from the material and waits, waiting for the right opportunity. And again, when something opens, it eagerly rushes back to help. The problem and the solution is finally back to us as individuals within the community. And if we can each make that effort to form small nucleuses, don't even try to make the community what it's supposed to be. Just make these nucleuses where that spirit continues and continuity for the future is established. The rest will happen automatically. So I think I'll pause on this. These were quite extensive examples, although Sri Aurobindo is making very broad statements. Like I said, these are broad strokes which cover so many things in just a few words. And if we understand the full import of it, it is extremely valuable for the perfection of physical life and our physical consciousness. He then takes up the specific example of the school and the physical education program, which we will take up next Friday. Maybe if there are any questions, we can take them up quickly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not just the best in the community, but each one in the community, if we make a personal alignment to the new consciousness of the new world, make a personal connection and personal allegiance and personal effort to become a conscious instrument for the divine will. That's the best we can do. The scope of the battle is what it is. There has never been any illusions about it, even in the way the Mother and Sri Aurobindo spoke of it. They never said it's going to be easy. They even described in detail what are the kinds of problems which will appear. But that being the case, there is a special power that they have established here by which, if we put ourselves in the right relation, then it can be done far more easily here and now than anywhere else in the world. So just as the difficulties are greater, the help from the divine is also greater. And if we can make that exclusive allegiance, and the key word here is exclusive, then that can act directly. Where our allegiance is mixed, because there are parts of my nature which are still refusing, not collaborating, even rebelling, then I become also the part of the battlefield. So, integration of my whole being around my central aspiration, and a conscious effort to align myself more and more completely to the single purpose for which I am here, and consciously giving myself to her force. That would be the single most important thing we can do. And if that much we can do, the rest, the force will act. You see, it can make of each one of us a vibhuti. Vibhutis are of two kinds. The kinds who are born, they come for the purpose and that's it. The other type is when a human individual rises in aspiration, in alignment to a divine possibility, and there is a descent of alignment of that possibility supporting the human. And that's the second type of vibhuti. So I gave a few examples earlier of people in the world. Many of them were perhaps born for that work. Many of them were perhaps people in whom that potential was there, the aspiration was there, and the alignment took place. But each one of us is in a sense a vibhuti, or can be an aspect, an expression of a particular possibility of a line of divine expression. That's what we mean by vibhuti. So that complete alignment to the divine will allows her to fill us with, even I will say, superhuman potential and capacity. And their work is done rapidly. That's the most important thing. That being the ideal case, in steps towards that, whatever little we do, the little in which, in small part of our life, we can make that connection, imbibe those values, and consciously express them in what we do, even in a small space. Maybe I can't do it when I'm interacting in the community space. I can do it in my private space. At least let me do it there. Maybe I can bring that in when I interact with one or two people. At least in those spaces, let me bring it in. Otherwise, I cannot. Doesn't matter. But where I can, gradually, and it's like an invasion. Just as the forces of confusion and falsehood can invade the spiritual space, so the spiritual force can invade life. And that's really our work.
You spoke a few months ago about a very practical thing to do. I'll give you the situation. I live with a few friends that for 2 years now outside Norway, and we move in a house in Norway very soon. And you said that when you are shifting from one place to another, if you have built something like I don't know, say present consciousness by collective reading, collective meditation, you can ask this consciousness or presence to follow you in your future house. So my question, quite practical, is how to proceed to call this to follow us.
Okay. It's a very specific thing. When we have invoked a presence on a particular location, or perhaps even at a fixed time through meditation or other practices, and we are moving to a new space, we inform that presence, sitting there in that presence, articulate it if you want in words. If you're able to express it without words, it's fine. Otherwise, you express it in words. That now we are moving to this location, and we want this presence to come there and continue this help and support now in this location or at this time. And that's it. And then when you go to that next space, you again invoke it. Here we are, we invoke this presence once again. It's as simple as that. What remains in the other place is an impact of that presence. And if the person coming into that space is sensitive, they will feel that something special took place here. If they cherish it, they can even build upon it. But the thing which comes and goes does not care where the location is. It can come wherever you are. Obviously, in wherever the new space is, you must create a similar receptive space and the aura of purity for it to be able to come the same way. I've seen my teacher do this. He used to have classes at 6:30 every day at his residence. And mother once told him, it was a meditation, there would be a study, discussion, and then a meditation. And mother told him, I will be present every day at that time. Now that's something very specific. She is putting an emanation of herself to be present there. And then one day, for certain reasons, he decided that he had to change the time of the meditation from 6:30 to 7. And I don't remember what it was. Either he mentioned it in passing, just like that casually, or it was very clear that he asked her to, informed her of the change. I think he made a comment or something in passing that he had informed her. But that was after she had left her body. And it was, I'll share with you another example which took place with me. Once I had to travel for a work which was considered very important. It happened to be the date given to us was on my birthday. It was some workshop to be done with the Indian Navy. And four of us were going from the ashram. And there was no way we could choose the date. And I felt a little distressed about it because I didn't want to be out on my birthday because it's something so special, one receives something so important. And then finally I said, well, what does it mean? Finally, there are people who don't know their birthday. They've just chosen a date and then they get what they want. What does it matter? For mother, it doesn't matter anyway. She has said things to this effect also, the darshan day. Every day can be special. It does not have to be a darshan day. It depends on your receptivity. So I said, fine. I then chose a date. Instead of 22nd, I said 18th. That's the day I will observe my birthday. And then psychologically, I prepared myself and I just said, well, this is my birthday and I'm going to observe it this way. And psychologically, once I set myself in that relationship, it was extraordinary. On the 18th, I received as I would on any other birthday. There was no difference from any other birthday. But then on the 22nd, when I was out of station, it was a flat day like any other. And even though I tried, I couldn't get anything unusual in that sense. So it was literally as if the force said, okay, this is what you want. Poof. It doesn't matter. You see, when the spiritual consciousness, by definition, originates timeless, spaceless in its origin and enters into domain of space and time. It is Lord of space and time. It can play with those circumstances just like that. The problem is of occult energies. They are part of nature's rhythms. And there you are stuck with laws and rules and rituals and forms and what the mathematical measurements of proportions of temples and all those things. If you want to do a yantra which invokes an occult force, yes, do all the mathematics correctly, otherwise it won't work. But when you want a spiritual power, it doesn't matter what it is. Of course, if it is harmonious, if it is beautiful, it allows the power to express through those qualities also. Otherwise, the powers can still come. It doesn't depend on the material instruments because it is the one who caused those rhythms of nature. It doesn't depend on them. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think the work that Mother did through Kuei established a very important truth, yogic truth in the collective consciousness. And one can tap that even as part of our yogic practice, not necessarily following that particular form in which we expressed, but the principle of it as a positive affirmation stated in words with the full alignment of thought, feeling, and speech, done in a state of concentration with an intention, and it has the effect of a mantric repetition that seeps into the whole atmosphere of our personal aura and even down to our physical consciousness. And one can even overcome physical limitations with that. This positive affirmation can be done in the form of a prayer, or it can be purely as an affirmation. You can treat them as two different things, or you can even merge the two things. It has a different effect, though. The attitude is different in both. In prayer, you're putting yourself in touch or in opening to the divine force, whereas here it is an affirmation of a faith that is within you, which you're affirming on the rest of your being. So it's more an in-to-out movement acting upon your outer nature. So there's a difference of the priority and emphasis. But one could also combine it with a prayer and say an invocation to affirm, or an affirmation which opens in an invocation. Any of these things could be done. These things are not rigid. One can modify and play with possibilities. But key principles in the form that Coué took is the repetition, the alignment of thinking, feeling, and speech, which represents here the action, and the positive form of the affirmation. You cannot do it with a negation. You can't say, I am not getting tired. That doesn't work. You have to say, I am getting fresh, I am getting strong. It is what you say which happens. The mother's will is always present. When I make a personal affirmation, her will can work through my affirmation, whatever it is. Ideally, my will can be aligned with her and allow itself to become an expression of her will. But where I don't know or feel her will directly, I put forward what I think is my highest and truest understanding of what she would want. And then she works through it. And gradually she awakens in me the awareness of her will. So it need not be in contradiction. It is only when my will is not representing my highest, when I assert my ego, desire, or some other thing in the guise of a higher aspiration, I'm fooling myself, then I go in opposition to her will. But that's something which is a basic question of a basic honesty and transparency with oneself. If there's the basic sincerity, one knows. And there should not be this conflict ever. Generally, what is the divine will is not tied to a specific form. It can flow through any form. As long as the form is sincere, it will work through it. Well, in a sense, the best prayer is to offer oneself and the situation to the divine and say, thy will be done. This was what Mother said. She said there are many ways, and she gave, I think, 4 different forms of prayer. One for the physical, one for the vital, one for the mental. And then this for the highest, I think it is the psychic, thy will be done. And then you let her choose freely. That's the form in which that prayer comes. I think she's given 4 prayers. I don't remember the details now. If someone can dig it out, we can share it next time. But then it depends on each person. For some people, there is a very clear need in different parts for a specific prayer. You do that also. And you can even combine and say, Mother, this is what I understand to be the best. If it is different, show me the way. Until then, I will do my best in this way. Even that is fine. There's an experiment which was also done. I came across it a few years ago, where plants were grown. One was left as a control group of plants. The second, where people went and prayed every day, grow, become healthy, grow well, etc., have green leaves, whatever it was they prayed. And the third one, where they went and prayed, thy will be done. And it's interesting, the first control group, of course, is the constant reference. The second group grew to be more healthy, but the third group was the most healthy. because the divine knows best what rhythm to follow. If you make the plant grow flowers or fruits too soon, it may not be the best thing for the plant. But when you say, Thy will be done, the divine knows the best means and the best rhythm also for its growth.